Hello again, True Drews. So, you know how in last week's episode I said, wouldn't it be so cool if you had extra bonus content from the podcast? Well, now you do. Introducing True Drew Files. In this exclusive show, you'll receive monthly bonus episodes where we do deeper dives into Nancy Drew's universe. We'll talk about common tropes within the Nancy Drew books, our Nancy Drew game crushes, and so much more. So, what are you waiting for? Don't pull a Nancy Drew and say, it's locked. Unlock True Drew Files today, available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Now on to our 30th episode. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the podcast, True Drew Podcast. I am so excited. This is our 30th episode. I cannot believe that I started this podcast in October and have had the opportunity to read so many Nancy Drew books and talk about them with you all. But I just want to say real quick, thank you for listening. Thank you for following along on Instagram at True Drew Podcast. I really appreciate it. And any of the reviews you all have left on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that helps me so much. Gosh, and I cannot believe that it's May already. I am so ready for summer and just getting to have some more downtime and read some more of these books while I'm on vacation or just whenever. So today, for the 30th episode, we're going to be talking about The Clue of the Leaning Chimney. And this is the 26th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first written in 1949. So this book has a couple of different covers, and if you ever want to see these covers, as always, I like to post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays, the day before the episode airs. So in the original 1949 cover, we have Nancy up in a tree, and she's looking over the fence into this compound, and we can see a Chinese symbol written on the chimney, and Bess and George are down below her, kind of trying to peep through knotholes in the fence. Nancy has shorter and redder hair in that first cover, but in the second cover, we just see Nancy. We don't see Bess or George, but she's up in this tree, again, looking over the fence, and she's wearing a little blue skirt and a floral collared shirt. Her hair almost looks more kind of like a dirty blonde, and she looks much younger to me in this cover. It's interesting how sometimes they almost make Nancy look like a pinup girl or like a vamp in some of the older covers, and then in others, she looks very young and very childlike. What can we say? Nancy Drew is an enigma. So I gave the book covers for The Clue of the Leaning Chimney a 3 magnifying glass rating. They're not my favorite, but they do show a bit of action and they accurately represent the book. However, my favorite part is to come up with a funny cover spoof for the books, and this one was too easy. Like, some of them are very challenging and I can't come up with a good cover spoof, but this one I said, so that's what the neighbors have been up to. Now, as far as our cast of characters goes, there is Dick Milton, who is Bess's cousin, but what's weird about this is, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure in the Whispering Statue, there was a boat attendant at the resort, the yacht club, and his name was Dick Milton. So there's some kind of an error there, like somebody didn't catch that there were 2 of the same names in the series. But there's also a Mr. Sung, there is Ching, Mr. Sung's servant, John Manning, who turns out to be David Carr, Miles Monroe, who is a geologist, and Ing Moy and Ing Lei. So you've probably already guessed from some of the names that I just read out, but also the Chinese character that's on the chimney on the cover of this book. But there are quite a few people from China in this book, and they are treated horribly. So the characters, they have a happy ending, but it's a little hard to read at points. So we're going to jump right in with the synopsis. Nancy and Bess nearly run into a man in the middle of the road during a storm and see he is holding a package. Nancy offers to help him, but he yells at her to go away, but not before she sees that it's a vase. When Nancy describes it to Bess, she says her cousin, Dick Milton, has one at his shop, but when the girls go by there, it has been stolen. Nancy quickly gets wrapped up in an art fraud and thievery scheme following the trails of stolen pottery. She follows a lead about a leaning chimney and finds a secret room in a boarding house and then a heavily walled compound that used to be a Civil War smelting mine. Carson has also been tasked by Mr. Sung to find his missing friends Ing Moy and Ing Lei. A lead comes when Mr. Sung notices his friend Ingmoy's signature in some pottery. It has to be a cry for help. Nancy and Mr. Sung sneak into the compound and find the Ings and the sketchy counterfeit pottery ring. Nancy is able to escape, find the police, and capture the bad guys. So, in the last book we discussed, The Ghost of Blackwood Hall, Nancy was dealing with these spiritualists who were scammers, and they were taking money from all these elderly people who thought they were in contact with their dead relatives. And now in this book, we have people who are being basically held as slaves to make this pottery. It's so bad. Like, some of the topics in some of these Nancy Drew books are so dark. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with for this book is Counterfeit Art Crime Ring Captured, Unlawful Workers Freed. So yeah, that is just a hint of what's to come, but we're going to jump right into the direct quotes that I took down for the clue in the Leaning Chimney. So the first note that I took down is Nancy and Bess made $342.63 at a charity rummage sale. And I was just curious what that would be in today's money. So that was in 1949, but in 2024, that would have been $4,415.98. Whew, that inflation though. I mean, we all knew that Nancy had some good stuff, but that's pretty wild. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy is able to tell that the man she's following in the woods is short and wears lifts in his shoes. And I put, that's pretty impressive. I don't know, she knows when cars are too heavy to go over bridges. She knows when people are faking how tall they are. Like, that's some impressive skills. So Nancy finds a leaning chimney and the woman who helped raise Hannah, Miss Wendell. I thought that was kind of cool that we kind of got a little bit of Hannah's origin story. There was another woman who raised her who was a housekeeper, and so Nancy and Miss Wendell go upstairs to see the room of one of her boarding house renters, and Nancy sees a man disappear through a wall. So she gets a hatchet and chops through the wall and finds this room full of Chinese pottery. I love that Miss Wendell sees nothing wrong with this 18-year-old girl just wielding a hatchet and just attacking her house. Like, I don't see most people taking too kindly to that. But they call some police officers, and they come and they interrogate Miss Wendell and Nancy explains how she was just looking for a leaning chimney and found a criminal. And one of them says, "I guess that's what they call woman's intuition. I wish I had some of it." So my next note is that Nancy uses that intuition a little bit further, and she finds a list of shops and museums and pictures of stolen pottery that are rolled up in this window shade in the secret room. I mean, this was after the police left. They didn't even think to look there. So Nancy and George get knocked out in the woods. They get hit over the head, and I think we're now officially up to like 5 or 6 times that this has happened to Nancy, at least, which I don't know how she doesn't have a concussion. My next note says, I don't like how they describe people in this book. So they say the Chinese instead of the Chinese man, or the way they say it in these books is so bad. I cringed a lot while reading this book. The next thing that I took a note of is Nancy, Bess, and George go to Helen Townsend's birthday, who is another friend of theirs, and she gets lingerie as a present, which I said, does anyone else think that's like a super awkward thing to get at your birthday in front of all these people? But Nancy also gets Helen a kitten, and I said, talk about one-upping and getting her the best present ever. Now, the next thing that I wrote down is the vase at the Townsends is stolen, and Nancy's purse is found in the yard. So all of her evidence was taken from her purse, and then they just threw it out in the yard. I mean, that's a pretty brazen thief to go and steal a vase from somebody's house while they're having a house party. Like, that's pretty ballsy. The next thing that I have down here is Nancy investigates an old Civil War smelting iron mine, and Bess sees a bony hand reaching out of a chimney. So they're up on a ladder and they're climbing these trees to look over the fence to see what's behind it, and someone reaches their hand out of the chimney, and it was really kind of creepy imagery, but it kind of leads us to believe there's more going on behind this fence than we're aware of. So my next note is just Nancy and Dick Milton, Bess's cousin, have a weird ghost pottery moment. They just devote like several paragraphs to Dick twisting this clay, and it's just so weird. It's just the way they wrote it was odd. But I'm like, he's married. I don't know. Sometimes, I don't know. I think it's the way they write back then. It's odd. Like, they exchange several glances. It's a lot of paragraphs to devote to just making pottery. Now, there is a cute part of this book where Togo gets up in bed with Nancy and acts like he wants to go with her to New York. And I just love that Togo is in so many of the books since Whispering Statue. That's the first book we saw him come into. And it's just so cute. It makes me want a dog. The next note that I took down has to do with Aunt Eloise, and it says, the book says Nancy favors Aunt Eloise in appearance and personality. I think Aunt Eloise, in a lot of ways, is like the mother that Nancy didn't ever have, and kind of in the same way that Hannah Gruen is. So this next note has to do with Mr. Sung, and he recognizes a signature of his friend Ing Moy's on some pottery that he sees, and so this is when Nancy starts to realize, like, they may be in trouble, and according to Mr. Sung, Ing Moy and Ing Lei were coming over to America from China, and they were supposed to meet up, and they just never contacted him again, so he thinks that it's odd, and he thinks something has happened to them. Now, the next thing that I took note of is when Nancy, Bess, and Ned are at Helen Townsend's wedding, Bess looks at Nancy meaningfully and says, "Don't you want to catch the bouquet?" And someone else does, but it's kind of funny because she's definitely making a comment about Nancy and Ned by saying that. Now, Nancy and Ned actually do some snooping after the wedding, and they see somebody with a flashlight near the Civil War smelting mine, the old compound, and they find a jade elephant. But then, while they're out looking around in the woods, Nancy's car gets stolen. But Nancy later sneaks over the fence into the compound, and she sees that there's china clay being used for pottery, and she avoids a guard dog and later brings Mr. Sung back, and they find Ing Lei and Ing Moy. So they've been held captive in this compound, forced to make this pottery that they never wanted to make. And it's so sad. It's crazy. But there's also, Nancy, Bess, and George encounter these people called the Lavender Sisters, and it's a fake religious group. So they're using that to cover up what's really going on. And I was like, what is with these fake religious groups? We have the Lavender Sisters. We had the Black Snake Colony in Secret of Redgate Farm. It's just crazy how many people use that as an excuse. Also, the Ings were held captive for 4.5 years at this place. That is crazy. So Mr. Sung has been looking for them for all this time, but that's a long time to be held enslaved and in captivity. And the last note that I took down is that Ching, who was the assistant to Mr. Sung, was actually David Carr's brother. So that was a huge twist I was not expecting. Now, I also thought it was interesting because sometimes Nancy gets gifts from people when she solves these mysteries. And so the gift that she received at the end of this book was a vase of her and the Ings on it, and she's protecting them from a dragon who they say is David Carr. So normally at this point in the episode, I would go to the segment I like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, but she didn't really do too much cooking in this book, so I'm going to skip right ahead to the Add That to Your Resume section. So for this book, I said that Nancy could add footprint analyst to her resume because she somehow knows that this guy who's walking through the woods is much shorter than his shoes make him appear, and then she could tell that he's wearing lifts in his shoes. And I also said that Nancy could say she's Paul Bunyan because she just takes a hatchet and starts attacking Miss Wendell's house, which is wild. And the last thing that I wrote down is Nancy could say that she's a babysitter, so she actually does some babysitting randomly in the middle of this book. It's kind of funny because most of the time we get Nancy running from criminals and helping the cops, and then just in the middle of the book she's doing some babysitting. So now I'm going to jump right into the things I liked about The Clue in the Leaning Chimney and the things that I didn't like. So what I liked about this book is that this mystery seemed really realistic. There are a lot of cases in real life where people get, put in a situation where they're having to work against their will and they're basically enslaved by other people, which is really unfortunate. But that made this mystery really lifelike. In the same breath, though, I did not like the cruelty that was put towards the Ings, and many of the other people, it was just crazy that they were basically enslaved in this place where they were making pottery for 4.5 years. And it's a good thing that Nancy was able to solve this mystery and help them get free. Now, as far as rating this mystery, I did still give it a 2 magnifying glass rating. It's not the best book, but it was very realistic and very good in a lot of respects, but it's still not one of my favorite Nancy Drew books. So yeah, that is the conclusion of today's episode on The Clue in the Leaning Chimney. I hope you all liked this episode, and next week we're going to be discussing The Secret of the Wooden Lady. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.